Hello, bruvs. We're back with Triad, a novel of the supernatural by Mary Leader. I haven't read much lately, bruv, because I've had a brutal work schedule. Went to some estate sales, and now I have a cough. So, Chapter 12. Alan drove me downtown for my first appointment. Deposited me at the front door of the building where Dr. Ambrose and his partner, Dr. Blaze, I don't know how to say that, had their offices, and then tactfully went about some business of his own for the next hour or so, although I was fully aware that he and the doctor had conferred previously. As I walked toward the entrance of the building, a dead starling fell at my feet, its neck broken from crashing into the tall glass cylinder looming above me. Looking toward the gutter, I saw several other dead birds lying there, and I shuddered. How beautiful the building had been in the jagged skyline as we were approaching it on the high, curving freeway, a giant keep that seemed to be slowly revolving as it shimmered in the warm Indian summer sun. The glass tower, I called it, although that wasn't its real name, but now I knew it for what it was, a great vitreous reef offering no resting places, only death to winged things. For a moment, I almost turned away from the entrance as if this had been a bad omen, but I chided myself for being silly, and in a few moments, I was seated in the psychiatrist's office, looking out at the breathtaking panorama of the harbor through pale aqua netting. "Excuse me for not opening the curtains," Dr. Ambrose apologized as he followed my glance, "but I keep them that way to prevent birds from crashing into the glass." I relaxed. I could like this man. In spite of this first impression, my early sessions with Dr. Ambrose were sparring matches rather than consultations, but that was mostly my fault. It's natural to fear any man who purports to see into your mind, who just by listening to you can classify and catalog you, and who holds the power if he sees fit to shut you away from the world. At first, I gradually watched for some reason not to trust him, but gradually my reservations began to break down. Everything about him belied my expectations. I confess to thinking in stereotypes, never having known a psychiatrist before. I'd imagined them to be the sum total of their patients' neuroses and psychoses, influenced, no doubt, by my memory of my college psychology professor, a fidgety, wiry little man with a disconcerting tick in one eye. According to campus rumor, he'd driven one wife to suicide and a second to divorce by keeping them under constant analysis. Dr. Ambrose was none of these. He moved in slow motion with nerveless ease, yet everything he did was controlled and purposeful. He was like a falcon poised in the air, scanning the ground for prey, and only his black eyes, peering out from under his shaggy white brows, contradicted the effect of total lassitude. They quickened with interest or became withdrawn and veiled according to the mood of the moment. But always, if one cared to look, one could detect an inner glow. As time went on, his droll humor, his abundant but unassuming wisdom, and a sort of shining kindness about him were gradually eroding my resistance. I suppose he was becoming a father image to me, if my own limited, unprofessional powers of analysis could be considered valid. There were times when I had the impulse to lay my head on his shoulder and sob the whole thing out. "Careful now, Brian Wynn," I would warn myself. "You'll give yourself away before you know it." Sometimes, however, Dr. Ambrose didn't talk about my problem at all. As Dr. Gordon said, he had a vast store of knowledge that was always spilling over, and often he would go off on tangents that were only vaguely related to me, or so it would seem. I remained alert in any case, for fear he might catch me off guard. Alan had told him that on occasion I had assumed the name Rhiannon and had even signed the name to a note to him. Dr. Ambrose asked me about this several times, but I always changed the subject or in some other way avoided answering him. And then came that special afternoon. The minute I entered his office, I sensed a change in his approach, an intensification of purpose. Yet there was nothing external to indicate this outside of any unwanted silence on his part. He didn't speak, merely nodded to me as I took my seat. He refilled his pipe and lit it with all the ceremony of an altar boy lighting candles, then leaned back, puffing it slowly, as if he had all the time in eternity to enjoy it, and eyed me thoughtfully. I sat across from him, uncertain, a little hostile, wondering what category he was putting me into. Branwen, he said at last, and I thought at first he was addressing me, but he wasn't. He was mouthing the name, savoring it. Branwen, he repeated, and Rhiannon. Beautiful old Welsh names. But then, you did say your background was Welsh, didn't you? Yes. My mother's parents came from Wales. I don't know if I mentioned it before to you. I was born there. In fact, I had my early schooling there. I was immediately interested. Of course, I thought there was something familiar about your accent, but I couldn't place it. Now I realize that at times you have a speech pattern similar to my grandmother's, but she died so long ago, I had almost forgotten. You seemed pleased. I left Wales to go to medical school, and, 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 he didn't stutter, I did. And I've been many places in the world since, so I'm surprised you noticed it at all. Do you have family left in Wales? I asked innocently. A shadow darkened his face. My mother was dead by the time I left. She came from a very proud and wealthy family. Not that any of their wealth was passed on to me, just enough to get me through college. I never knew who my father was. Then he smiled disarmingly. You see, everyone has hidden things they don't like to talk about. But you're talking about it. For the first time since I left home, I thought it might put you at ease. And just a trick to get me to open up, I suspected. Well, that's enough of that. He brushed it aside as he would an annoying cobweb. But it is pleasant to hear some of the old names again. Seems to me that Branwen and Rhiannon figured to Welsh in Welsh folklore. It's been so long I've forgotten the tales. You never would have if you'd heard my grandmother tell them, I said enthusiastically, feeling myself on sure ground now, although I couldn't see what it had to do with my case. My grandmother never talked to me, always called me that devil's son. He said it as a simple fact without bitterness, but I could have bitten my tongue anyways. My mother told me some stories, he continued, but she wasn't well, and she was not a natural storyteller. I do remember that Branwen was the sister of Bran, King of Wales, and he married her off to the King of Brittany. Or was it Ireland? Ireland, I believe, I said. You see, you do know it better than I do. Go on, tell me. Well, let's see. Oh, yes. Branwen had another brother. His name was Evnisian. He was the troublemaker. After the marriage feast, he mutilated the Irish king's horses, which caused a dreadful brawl. But Bran made restitution. Then the Irish king, Matholwich, took his bride and his court back to Ireland, where Branwen bore a son. At first, she and Matholwich were happy, but the Irish were still resentful about the horses. So they finally drove Branwen from the king's chambers and made her cook for the court. And the butcher had to give her a box on the ear every day. After suffering this for a year or so, Branwen tied a letter to the wing of a starling she had trained and told it where to find her brother in Wales, which at that time took in all of what is now England. It flew straight to Bran, who invaded Ireland as soon as he could sound up all his fighting men. His army sailed in ships, but Bran was so huge, he just waded. I like that part, he interrupted. A bit of Welsh bragging, I suspect. I laughed. Oh, I don't know, he rallied. Welshmen can do lots of things other people can't. Merlin transported all of Stonehenge from Ireland to England, but he couldn't save himself from ninnying. I countered, oh well, weakness for the fair sex has always been a racial characteristic among the Welsh. But I interrupted you. Go on with your story. Let's see, where was I? Oh yes, the Irish, being very much afraid, tried to outwit them by treachery, but they were found out, and there was a terrible fight, and almost everyone was killed on both sides. Branwen's baby boy was thrown into a fire and burned to death. Bran was shot with a poisoned arrow and was dying, so he made the 7 Welshmen who escaped cut off his head, and take that and his sister Bramwyn back to Wales. She, however, died of grief because two islands had been destroyed on her account. Bran's head was buried in the White Mount in London, where it protected England from its enemies until Arthur came along and dug it up because he felt it was a shame not to be able to protect England by his own valor. That was pompous of him. Look what it got him in the end. I'll bet Merlin never advised him to do that. Now, what about Rhiannon? I hesitated. Why was he suddenly so interested in the background of the names, particularly Rhiannon? For all he knew, that was merely a name I pulled out of a hat one night. He had no way of knowing about my cousin. Did he think my choice of that name had some special significance that could be explained by the tale behind it? But what? I'm afraid I'm taking up an awful lot of time, I demurred. You must have patience waiting. There's time, he insisted. You don't know how long it is since I heard the old tales. All right, if you say so, I consented. Rhiannon was another Welsh queen. She first married Pwyll, son of Dyfed, who met her out riding. She could travel so swiftly when she was only walking her horse that Pwyll, what fucking names are these? That Pwyll couldn't catch up when he was galloping his. Yes, I know they're Gaelic, but after many adventures, they were married, and she bore a son, Pryderi. His name was. He was one of the 7 Welshmen who later escaped Ireland with Branwen, by the way. A few nights after his birth, as Rhiannon lay sleeping, someone stole the boy, and her maids, fearful that they would be accused, smeared her mouth and hands with puppy blood and swore that she had killed her child. Pwyll refused to have her executed, but sentenced her to sit by the front gate and carry any visitors into the palace on her back. The boy was recovered some years later by a nobleman and brought to the palace, and Rhiannon once more was honored as queen. And after Pwyll died, Pryderi, whose name means anxiety, married his mother to Manawydan, still another brother of Branwen, who was also one of the 7 Welshmen. Thus Branwen and Rhiannon were sisters-in-law. Dr. Ambrose continued my story. I was betrayed. Doctor, you knew those stories all along. You were making fun of me, I reproached them. They laughed. No, not at all. I wanted to find out what you knew and associated with those names, particularly that of Rhiannon, since that's a name you apparently chose for yourself during a state of amnesia. And to be truthful, I was always more interested in the historical and anthropological background of the later Brythonic folk and fairy tales, so much so that in many cases I've forgotten the details. His long, brown hand lay on a pile of papers on his desk, unconsciously dog-earing the top ones. Branwen and Rhiannon were goddesses, you know, he said softly. I'd forgotten that, but that's right. Branwen's father was Lilr, the sea god, wasn't he? Yes, and Manawydan was a sea deity too. So both Branwen and Rhiannon were always associated with water, although that's left out of the later stories where they were only human beings. Originally, however, they were goddesses, possibly one and the same goddess in her different aspects: maid, woman, crone, her colors white, red, and black. Like Persephone, Demeter, and Hecate, I exclaimed. I was just writing about them. Exactly, the same family female trinity. 3 is a magical number in any religion. The great goddess of the Celts was Rigantona, of which name Rhiannon is a contraction. As the maid, she was benevolent and represented birth, hope, and budding untarnished life. As the woman, she was lustful and fickle, life in all its varying vicissitudes. But her third face was death, malevolent and terrible. The crow, which devours carrion, was her emblem. And in that function she was not entirely evil, for, called the Morrigan by the Irish, she and her cohorts gathered up the dead on the battlefield and carried them to the Celtic heaven. The tradition of Rigantona continued down the ages into the Arthurian cycle, where she emerged as Morgan Le Fay, the sorceress and half-sister of Arthur and his deadliest enemy. As Margaux, she incestuously bore Arthur's bastard Mordred, thus sealing his doom. She was one of the three queens who took his body from the battleground and bore him to the Isle of Avalon. Morgan was the death aspect of the Lady of the Lake. This was fascinating, but I failed to see where it was getting us. He must have seen the question in my face, for he asked, "Something bothers you?" I was just wondering what my name and the name Rhiannon have to do with all this. Bramwin, the name means white crow, would have been Rigantona or Rhiannon in her benevolent or innocent aspect. The name Rhiannon, by the way, is thought to have been corrupted into Ninian, another name for the Lady of the Lake. Wasn't she the same as Mallory's Nynaeve and Tennyson's Vivian? Yes, the name Nin is one of the oldest in the world. In Sumerian, it meant the lady and referred to their great goddess Ishtar. Nineveh means the city of the lady. It may just be coincidence. Of course, that Ninian was also called Nynaeve, as you mentioned, but who's to say how far back the memory of man extends? As Ninian, the Lady of the Lake, was Arthur's friend, I commented. Yes, but she was also the minx who lured Merlin into a cave and shut him up forever. Well, I can't exactly blame her. She was married to a handsome young knight, and then this old man in his dotage starts chasing her all over Europe. She had to get rid of him somehow, but in a cave. After all, his only crime was loving her, he chuckled. I see you women are all alike, heartless and cruel, true daughters of Riganton Tona, who was worshipped and cannibalistic rites, who was worshipped with cannibalistic rites, you know? No, I didn't know. Yes, indeed, our ancestors were all cannibals. That's echoed in the story of Pryderian, the blood smeared on his mother's mouth, possibly in the original version of the myth. Rhiannon actually ate her son. The coals in his eyes burned bright, holding me both entranced and aghast. How horrible, I said at last. If Aunt Megan had known that, I'll bet she never would have given that name to her darling daughter. I stopped, stunned and furious at him for his trickery, and at myself for being so stupid. And yet, strangely, there was almost a feeling of relief that I was being pushed so close to the brink, that the moment when I would tell him was inevitable. You had a cousin named Rhiannon? His tone suddenly was professional. You never mentioned her. Oh, she died when I was quite young. She was 4 years older. I tried to sound casual. How old were you at the time she died? 9. Then you must remember her quite well. Didn't you tell me earlier that your parents were identical twins who married each other? Was their child was this their child? Yes. She was my double cousin, I answered miserably, but she lived in the country and I was brought up in the city. You and she who you and she would have had identical bloodlines. Were you together much? Not too much. School kept us apart. What about vacation then? Vacation time. All right, I'm botching this. Let me pause for a second. We spent some vacations together, I admitted. How did you feel towards her? I admired her very much. I could say that with some conviction. She rode horseback like a centaur, and she was very efficient. But you didn't like her. I didn't say that. Neither did you say you liked her. I bit my lip and was silent. You're not cooperating with me, Bramwin, he reproved me. This is your sixth visit, and I know very little more about you than your husband has already told me. In fact, I'll bet you never mentioned your cousin Rhiannon to him, or he wouldn't have been so puzzled when you used that name. But if you won't do your part, you'll have just wasted your money and my time. What can I do to make you trust me? It isn't that I don't trust you, Dr. Ambrose, I replied. It's just because I've come to trust you so much. I mean, I believe you really do want to help me, even if you have to trick me to do it. That I'm afraid of you. That doesn't make much sense, does it? Yes, it does make sense, he said, turning to answer the phone. Pardon me, he excused himself, motioning me to keep my seat. I didn't want to seem to be listening to his conversation, so I opened my handbag to get out my makeup, as I knew I had been biting my lips naked. The next thing I knew, I was holding my fountain pen in one hand and a small notebook in the other. Across the page to which it was open, I noticed a hasty scrawl. Let me out. I want to talk to the doc, too. Oh, shit. I brushed my hand across it, smearing the ink. There was no question but that it had been written in that instant and by my hand, even though it was not my handwriting. I stared at it as the uneven letters began to distort, curling and crawling across the page, which faded into an atomized distance as waves of dizziness engulfed me. Waves washing over me, receding and returning, reaching for me with frothy talons, then faltering and breaking upon the sand. I was running along the shore under a lowering sky with a sheer cliff to my left, the greedy waters to my right, and the beach growing narrower and narrower, but someone was calling to me to turn back to water. Safer ground, I wheeled and struggled toward it. Bramwin, Dr. Ambrose phone, still in hand, was watching me with alarm. I'm all right, I assured him weakly. He concluded this call quickly and, coming around the desk more rapidly than I had ever seen him move before, drew up a chair beside me. What happened? I thought you were going to faint. I was just about to call my secretary to get you something. No, no, don't do that. I was drawn into the deep of those black eyes, and then suddenly the power to resist them was gone. I'll tell you about it, about everything, if you promise me one thing. What is that? That you'll respect my confidence and not tell Alan anything that I don't want you to. It's not that I wish to deceive my husband, but I think he'd be happier not knowing some of this. At least not for now. He might not understand. I wouldn't blame him if he didn't, and I'm so afraid it would undermine our marriage. The pack sealed, I told my story haltingly at first, but as I proceeded, the words flowed with increasing ease. When I at last broached my theory that Rhiannon had somehow attached her personality to mine, I stopped, searching his face for signs of derision or contempt, but he merely sat there, his eyes half closed like those of a sleepy owl, saying nothing. You think that's impossible? That I'm crazy or something? I asked apprehensively. Why don't you finish before I comment? He said, then relented. He added, I'll say one thing. I think you exaggerate your condition. Reassured, I told him everything, even the wild statements Rhiannon had made about Timmy's death and about the baby. Last of all, I handed over the note I had in my hand. This was written just now in your office while you were on the phone, without my knowledge, and yet I am sure that it was my hand that wrote it. Then there just couldn't have been any other. What or who makes me do these things? You've got to believe me, Dr. Ambrose. I'm not faking this. He scanned the note carefully. Yes, he said, looking up, it ties in with the typewritten one your husband gave me, and I believe you when you say you're not faking. Are you willing to submit to hypnosis, Branwyn? Yes, I suppose so, but why? I think it would open up things in the subconscious mind that you can't consciously bring to the surface. You mean you want to talk to her, don't you? I asked. If she exists, yes, I do. If I possibly can. He looked at his watch. I'm afraid we've run out of time today. Besides, I want you to go home and think about this. That it's something you really want to do. I assure you it won't give me undue power over you. Don't worry, I know the Svengali bit was exploded long ago. True, but hypnotism in the hands of an tour or criminal is still a dangerous weapon, particularly in the area of post-hypnotic suggestion. I'm sure Dr. Gordon would never have recommended you if he didn't have complete confidence in you. He looked at his appointment book. You're booked for tomorrow, aren't you? He remarked. Yes, I am. His face lighted up, and I felt warmed by the glow of it. Then tomorrow it is, he said, shaking my hand. I went out, feeling as though the only weight I had for the moment was the baby, that I had left my other burden still seated in his chair. Chapter 13 awaits, bruv. Chapter 13. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.